Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor.
And I'm Lisa. And today we are really looking forward to talking about a couple of topics that have come directly from conversations with grievers in our hub or questions that we received. Specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about this idea we have of maybe taking steps backwards in grief or worrying that we're somehow regressing or moving back in the wrong direction. And I think this is a big question for people, especially as we're getting into a new year, as we have talked about, and we're thinking about forward motion.
Yeah.
We can get in our heads about whether we're moving the wrong way.
Yeah. And those of you who listened to our episode last week will recognize that some of the themes that we said were quote unquote in for 2025 come up a little bit about how we are trying to think about things in terms of cycles sometimes more than moving towards an endpoint in this forward linear path. And also just a little bit about how, even when we feel like we're making steps, they can still feel really mixed. And it's not always clear cut that we're, in a better place all of a sudden. So we hope that you enjoyed today's conversation.
Yeah, it was funny. I was just saying how yesterday in our Getting Things Done Together session, something came up about the idea of regressing in grief. Like somebody was saying that they felt like they had, with where they were, they felt like they had kind of regressed from where they had been recently. They were struggling. I think anybody who has grieved has been there in that, like, wow, I thought I was doing well. What happened? Now I feel like I've been, I've hit a brick wall. And one of the things I felt like it was important for us to pause and talk about was just that whole idea of regressing and how, one, I just don't think it's, I just don't think it's real. Like, I don't think that regression is the right word for what happens in grief. And that there is just definitely a cycling that happens, and whatever we want to call it, ebbs and flows, waves, all, the analogies and different language people use to try to capture it. I think the fact that there are so many ways people try to capture it is an indicator that it's hard to explain. But I guess what felt important to me, where I thought, oh, we should either write about this or talk about this, is how important it is to contrast it with regression. Like, we're not moving backwards just because we're suddenly having a harder time than we were a week ago or a month ago or 6 months ago. That doesn't mean that we have somehow moved backwards in some way. But I think it's hard to not feel that, like that. Somehow that feels like it must be true. If I'm struggling more, I must have regressed.
I struggle with this a lot in terms of language and talking about grief, because I will talk out of both sides of my mouth. I'll say, like, grief is not linear. We're not like moving in a line, but then I will use phrases like grief journey. And even though I don't necessarily mean we're on one particular path, that's what it evokes, So I often end up leaning into language and metaphors and words, cliches, have you, that give the sense that we are on this straight path. And when you brought this up, I said, I have like an intro to an article written about this, because I think something that sets us up to feel bad sometimes, and you use the word regression, or like you're moving backwards, things like that, is this idea that we're we as people are always moving forward. And I don't actually know that that's true. Like, we're getting older. Our bodies are getting older. We might be collecting, knowledge and experiences, but are we necessarily like always moving forward? Or are we just kind of like existing and trying to live a life every day that, maybe connects with meaning and purpose and things like that? Like, we're trying to grow in some ways, and in that sense there is kind of a forward trajectory, but it's not that we are necessarily as people moving forward. We're in many ways kind of like existing, and we're growing things around us, like we're growing seeds, right? And sometimes our gardens feel like they are like really blossoming and full, and some seasons they feel like something has gone wrong. There's nothing growing here. It's barren. And I think that if we stop thinking we're on this forward path, then we can move away from these ideas that we're necessarily regressing when things go wrong. It's just like, no, this is maybe a bad season or a bad period or a difficult time. I don't know. It's hard for me to like find the right words to explain it, but I do feel, what I do know is that this idea that we're supposed to be always moving forward causes people so much strife. And this is not to say I don't think that we should have things we want to achieve and goals and ways we want to grow and things like that. I think we should have all those things. But I also just think we should get rid of this idea that we as people are like moving forward and needing to like grow and be different every single day of our life.
Every single day. Well, because there's not, right? It implies there's some sort of destination, which again is not accurate. But also I think it has like value connotations in that idea that we should somehow be growing in our grief or learning, or our grief should be giving us grand insights, or
like we should always be better the next day than we were the next day before.
Right.
And that's just not life.
No, it's just not life. And at all. I heard someone on a podcast, not that I listened to not a while ago. And I don't know, maybe he had heard it somewhere else. I can't remember, but he talked about the idea that he liked the phrase grief is a landscape. And when I first heard it, I was like, do I like that? Do I not like it? I don't know if landscape captures the thing that does resonate. And it even came up as a visual image in my mind just now when you were talking about the garden and the seasons of life and the things that cycle, is this visual of the cycles of nature. Like, I do love the idea of imagining kind of like a huge landscape that has like mountains and fields and forests and, kind of a huge landscape. And the idea that we're kind of walking through it and the seasons are changing and we're going through night and day and cycles, and things are blooming and dying, and things are green and things are bare, and there's different weather. And, I like the idea, or I think that idea represents to me more what life is. Not that we're going in some clear direction, or I'm going through that landscape from point A to point B, but that like I'm like wandering through it and just taking it as it is and being mindful and appreciating what's happening in that moment, and hopefully trying to figure out how to have just, I don't know, the flexibility to be within that. And that does really resonate to me about how life ebbs and flows, and that grief, we're never regressing.
Right. Exactly. And honestly, like though I don't like that forward momentum idea, I just think it's one that comes very natural to people. So if people must have that notion, or if they find that they keep going back to it and they can't, like, I don't know, if they're like very visual and they can't come up with a better way to like conceptualize, because a lot of people do think that way, then if you are one of those people, I really encourage you to think about grief as not being something that happened on your timeline and that stays at that spot on your timeline. Acknowledging that now that thing has happened, it's like that earthquake happened, and now for the rest of your life you can experience, aftershocks basically, or you're carrying it with you forward now, and every once in a while that is going to feel heavier than it did. And that doesn't mean you're back at that point. It just means that grief, it just comes up. It's maybe a new, whether you want to think about it as a really tall hill you have to climb, or a really deep, hole you have to like get through. That's going to happen. And there's a lot of reasons, like we talk all the time about how secondary loss is something that happens at the time of our loss, but it's also something that comes up for the rest of our lives, because we're going through our life and we're having new experiences that maybe remind us of our loss, or that make us think, gee, I wish this person were here with me at this time. And so secondary loss is going to create an experience where it continues to come up. That's not regressing. That's experiencing loss differently. Maybe you're seeing it through a new lens. You've changed the way you look at people or life, and you're starting to reevaluate how you look at your loss. Or maybe, as I said to Lisa a couple times, like sometimes when I'm just going through a difficult time that's not even grief related, it brings up my grief. Like it could be something totally different has caused me to feel this way, whether it's like depression, or it's job, loss, or change, or anything, relationship problems, whatever it is. Something else can cause you to feel a certain way, but then it can bring up feelings of grief and loss. So you're thinking, oh, I wish I had that person to support me in this time. Oh, these emotions feel very similar to the ones I was experiencing then. And I think it's important, like, because there are definitely people out there who will say that you haven't completed, grieving your losses. You haven't properly worked through them. There are people out there who are going to want you to think that you're regressing, or going to want you to think that you haven't properly worked through your grief in the first place, if it's still coming up. And honestly, like, there are examples of times when people need to work through things. Obviously, I realize that. But there is also a very normal human experience where things just keep coming up because they're important to us.
No, it reminds me, one of the things it reminds me of, and even like the language of it is similar, is in the world of substance use and in AA, there can be this big focus on days. Like, how many days have you been sober, and counting days, and it becomes a big focus. And then when someone relapses, then people will say they feel like they've lost everything. They're back at the beginning. They're starting over again. It's this huge regression. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that over the years I have said to so many people when working with people where substance use is an issue and they have and they relapse is, you didn't lose that time. Yeah. Like, you didn't somehow regress back to the beginning. All of the life experience, everything that happened during that period of sobriety, that didn't go away. Like, that's still with you. And it reminds me, there's, the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus has that quote, no person, or no man, meaning person, no man steps into the same river twice, because it's not the same river and he's not the same man. With that idea that, like, we even if we wanted to, we can't go back. Like, we're always changing. The world is always changing. And that's always reflected in where we are. And I think it's so important to remember, like, yes, there are always these new secondary losses that are coming up. Grief is learning. And so we're always like learning how to be in the world. And there's new moments that we have to learn how to be in. And it will feel hard and overwhelming. And in some ways may then feel like it felt in the beginning. And that doesn't mean we're actually back at the beginning.
Totally. You've still learned, you've still grown, you've still experienced, you've still struggled, you've still all of it. Lori, I appreciate your post here in the comments. The passage of time is one of the things that can contribute to thinking about grief in terms of progress moving forward, et cetera. And I feel like, it's a good point that the passage of time in and of itself is a big part of our grief, right? And so it's interesting, because I think that the passage of time can make people feel often very panicked about their grief sometimes, like, oh my gosh, I'm moving so far from the time where I experience life with this person. I'm losing them in some senses. Something for me that I struggled with was just the sense that my mom was starting to feel more abstract than like tangible. And so I do think the passage of time in and of itself can cause us to experience grief. And so it's interesting because you're right. We do say, oh, X number of years or months or however long has passed and we're here. And it's sort of setting ourselves up for failure in a sense, because it's like, well, if you're making that assessment on a bad day, you might feel like you haven't made any strides at all, because maybe you do sometimes feel like you're back at square one with it, you know? And so I think it is interesting because I do think we have this natural tendency to assess how we're doing after a certain period of time. And grief is one of those areas where it's like, okay, if you're going to take that assessment on this day that feels really bad, I want you to take it again in maybe like a week or two, because you might feel a little bit different if it's not something that is like, you know, really pervasive in that time of your life.
Yeah, and sometimes, I don't know, like, that awareness that we think that because we're accumulating more experiences, that should be moving us towards something like grow, like positive growth
Enlightenment and self-actualization
and self-actualization. Yes, and like being a better version of ourselves as we're going through. And I think sometimes for me, I think about this in my own life a lot, is that I think that it is for me like that the thing that has happened is I've been able to become so much more flexible with myself and the world, to like not have expectations and self-judgments about the way things are happening and unfolding.
Mhm.
And that is maybe something I do to some degree measure as a linear thing, or that something that I've wanted to get better about, is being able to just be, I don't know, open to the fact that it's
Yeah.
all messy. But I think it has also helped me in a lot of other ways to not feel like things are otherwise supposed to be unfolding in this
Yeah.
linear way.
I think knowing it's normal is important, because you know the concept of like learned helplessness, where it feels like
Yeah,
nothing you do can change your
can change your
circumstances.
Mhm.
If you're expecting that this amount of grief therapy and this amount of support groups or whatever formula it is going to lead you to not experience bad grief days, I really think you can get to this place of starting to feel like really helpless and unable to like do anything to help your circumstances, because no matter what you do, you're not eliminating those bad grief days. But if we
Mhm.
see them as a normal part of living with that experience, with living with a continued bond with somebody very important to us, I think that we then can maybe set different markers and goals for ourselves where we can impact change a little bit. You know, and what that looks like will depend for everybody on what's important to them. But I do think if we're asking ourselves to not ever feel bad days, not ever have days where you're like feeling worse than you felt a year ago, I think that we're setting ourselves up. Now, if you're really getting years later, you find yourself really back in a struggling place that's getting in the way of your day-to-day functioning, and that's going
Yeah.
on for a really long time, I don't know, then maybe I think it's time to say, this doesn't feel quite normal or expected. Let me whatever, go to a therapist, talk to my doctor about what's going on, so on and so forth. But yeah, I just think those bad days, even you were, as you were talking, I don't know why it made me think of this, but I think, like you were saying, you've learned to become more flexible, kind of in knowing yourself. And I feel like something that I've noticed about myself is that I'm just very cyclical. And and it's something that I've accepted, but I also, that frustrates me to no end, because like the minute we get into winter, I always feel terrible. And like that's like an ongoing, like, you know, thing. And so I think for me, I've noticed that I can expect, and maybe